The Economic Club of Minnesota's mission is to provide a world-class, nonpartisan forum for national and international leaders in business and public policy to discuss ideas that affect how Minnesota can better compete in the global economy. The Economic Club of Minnesota, engaging the world, strengthening Minnesota.
Well, thank you, Brian. So I, as Brian mentioned, have the great privilege of serving on the Target Board, which I joined. This will become important later. Which I joined about 1.5 years ago, and I would just say we are really, really pleased to have you in the community at Target. Brian's a great guy and a great addition to the community. So thank you very much for the kind words. So here's the fun part about doing a speech in your hometown. See if I can figure out how to make this thing work. You end up getting a lot of advice. So it's local speech, worried friends, and they start giving you all kinds of tidbits, like some of it is style. Hey, Doug, don't be afraid to be short. You get a lot of content help. You know, you serve on some, can we do this? Can we do that? You know, please try not to do a food safety speech during lunch. You know, we have a small business. It gets a outsized share of media attention in the pest elimination business. You know, we could go wax on bed bugs and all the rest. But it was all suggested that I try not to do that. And of course, my favorite advice came from a good friend said, you know, talk about anything but water. So that advice I chose not to listen to, because I really do want to talk about water today. There's a lot of subjects that are probably very appropriate for a conversation with this group. This one probably doesn't get the same attention it deserves. It's starting to make it on top of a lot of media lists, but I don't think there is deep understanding of why this is an issue and why it's going to end up likely being germane for every large company that operates, and as a consequence of that, for all of us too. So there's an old Chinese saying, which is, don't look for the waves, look for the currents. And we work to do that, particularly when we're doing strategic planning, because we have proven over time at Ecolab to be very inept at planning cycles. I don't know anybody who's really good at it. So we don't know when an economy in a given region is moving one direction or another. But what we do look for and try to understand are what are some of the big trends that are going on. And if you're going to make big bets, bet on big trends, because they're easier somewhat to bet on and to ride. And so these are a list of 8 that we tend to focus on over the last, say, 5 to 10 years. And so it really starts at the heart of it with population growth, and then underneath that, you've got an emerging middle class, particularly in emerging countries. And this newer middle class is changing its diet. So while population may be growing 20 to 25%, this diet, which is a move from cereals to protein, means you're going to need 50 to 100% more calories to feed this larger population. The number one user of water, which I'll talk about, is agriculture. So this puts additional pressure on an already scarce water situation. You've got big population groups in already water-scarce regions like China, where China has 25% of the fresh water per capita that we have in North America. The new middle class wants technology, it begets more energy, on and on and on. And so how do you understand this and what's it going to do to the world? And as you go through this, it becomes clear, and this has been well talked about by many smarter people than me or anybody else at our company, which is this nexus between energy, water, and agriculture. So biofuels are sort of the poster child for this, but it extends way beyond biofuels conversations, simply because agri, by nature, takes a lot of water, it takes a lot of energy, and as you have more caloric needs, you're going to put more pressure on both energy and water. And the second largest user of water would be energy in all of its sources, including power and everything else. So you end up with this cycle, which is important to understand, and you see countries like China with aggressive investments in Africa, largely because they have a very difficult situation. They don't have enough water to be both energy and food independent. So they have to think about how are they going to manage this as they go forward. So when you look at everyday products and water's use, water is the secret sauce in basically everything that we use. So we didn't have a hamburger for lunch, but if we had, it would be 450 gallons of water to produce a hamburger. When you start looking at the inputs into the meat and the bun, 55 gallons of water for a cup of coffee. That's a good trade. Now, if you go home tonight and this speech has really depressed you, and you decide to slam down 6 beers, I would not advocate it, by the way, but you'd be consuming 167 gallons of water input. Newsprint, so it's 2.6 gallons of water, but that's not like a tablet of paper, that's a sheet of paper. So the average newspaper at your door takes about 400 to 500 gallons of water to produce if you go through this, and 700 for shirts, and then my favorite is a car. I'm not sure how we stopped at 39090. It's a very, I think it's probably car dependent, but in this case, a minivan would tip you over 40,000 for all you large car drivers. So where does water get used? 70%, this is an average around the world, it's for agricultural inputs, 20% for industry, and really 10% is, if you will, home consumption. Of course, most of the big moves by government, at least here, have been around home, right? 1 gallon flush toilets and the like. So, it's the old adage, if you take care of the small things, the big things take care of themselves, or something like that. But the big water is used elsewhere. And that's really what fundamentally drives water consumption. So by the end, we know that we're going to have more people, they're going to need more food, they're going to demand more energy, and of course, this is going to result in more water. So the only reason this is really an issue is because water is a finite resource. And it's finite in the truest sense. Now, frankly, I'll get into it. It's quite plentiful. And there's more water than we need. But the problem is not all the water is usable. So all the water that's here is here. It doesn't get created. Also, after you use it, it's still water. So when you use a barrel of oil, it turns into other things other than oil. It's gone. But water, once you use it, gets recycled. And there's this great system in the world called nature that recycles water quite successfully. But the problem is most of it turns into salt water. So if you do an inventory of water, 97.5% of water is salt water. Salt water is highly corrosive, and it is not usable in almost any industrial application, obviously for human consumption or all the other things that we talk about. And only 2.5% of fresh water, or of the water, is fresh or usable. And if you look at that inventory down below, less than 1% of the water is truly accessible because most of fresh water is captured in glaciers and ice caps. And so while there's a lot of talk that these are melting, which they are, and it's a fact, where do they melt? They melt into the ocean. So all they're really doing is driving up the percentage of salt water. It's not like they melt in the middle of a continent. So that doesn't really help us. So it's a pretty small piece of the overall water pie that we get to use. So as a consequence, you get predictions from the World Bank, from the UN, from others, that in very short order, right, in the next 15 to 20 years, you're going to have a mismatch, this is a global average, of something like 50% between supply and demand of fresh water. Now, this is a bit of a misleading statistic because it's an average, and this is a challenge which is very different, watershed by watershed or community by community. And so Minnesota is unlikely to have this monstrous mismatch between freshwater demand and supply. But we're also 5 million people in a globe of 7 going to 9 billion people. And what you have is real regional challenges, even in the US, but in particular China, I mentioned India, emerging continents, obviously Middle East, where you're going to have major challenges which are not going to be easily managed. Now, the interesting thing, you'll sit around the dinner table and you'll talk about local produced food, and you'll talk about all these issues. The cheapest way to move water around is in finished agriculture products. So our prediction is while plenty of people will be moving to locally produced food, it's not going to feed 9 billion people. That food is going to be shipping great distances for as long as we're around, or we're going to have huge issues and a mismatch between food needs and food supply. And this country is in a good position to be one of the suppliers of food as we go forward, because it's easier to ship the cucumber than the 8 gallons of water it takes to grow a cucumber. So this is some of the math that's going to drive some of the things going forward. Now, this news and the factors in water are not new news, and if you see headlines, I get weekly a clipping from around the world, topics on water from all the major news media, and this started out relatively small. I will tell you, it is like pages and pages now long every week. So this is now getting a lot of attention, but as with everything else, it's until there's real action, not much is going to change. And it also isn't lost on business. So this is a result of a recent survey on a number of multinationals when asked about water and their perspective. The vast majority predict that it's going to be an impact on them. Many are already talking, 80%, that they're going to use these stats, i.e. water availability, for plant and site selection. We already are. We've got to build a new plant because of energy growth. The likely place would be down in the Southwest, but we now have to try to understand, is there going to be water supply there for the next 30 to 40 years to put this plant, because we're building capital that we expect to go generations or decades, and we've got to make sure that we put it in a place where there's going to be water for the same period of time as well. And more on that in a minute. We're not alone, and so this is the truth of the world, and this impact is becoming quite real. So we see this. We've talked to many of our customers prior to making the acquisitions that Brian mentioned, which are highlighted on this page. We served really farm-to-fork food safety, so a lot of the large food producers in the world, including Cargill, Dave's here, but including Hormel, General Mills, many of the companies that are large food producers. And big challenges that they started identifying were water scarcity, particularly as they expanded in emerging markets. So to equip ourselves to meet those needs and also what we thought was a larger need, we made a big acquisition called Nalco, who was the largest player in the industrial water and had a lot of technology which we thought was quite core, not only what they were going to do, but what we would do together. And then we doubled down in helping the energy segment deal with its water. So when you pull oil out of the ground, what are you principally pulling out of the ground? Water. It's like 10 parts water, 1 part oil. So you have to separate it, you got to clean up the water, you got to treat the oil, you got to do all these things, and that's technology that we provide. So our positioning now is this. It's clean water, safe food, abundant energy, and healthy environments. So we like this positioning because we think it's right for what the world's going to need, and we are hearing from companies it's what they need now. But it gives us an interesting view on the world, because here's a fact sheet for the company, but the two big, most important facts are 45,000 people, 25,000 of them are sales and service associates who are calling daily on customers in 171 countries at 1.3 million sites all throughout every month. So we have perspective across industries, across countries about what's happening in terms of water usage, energy consumption, pressure on business that many other people don't have. And so we obviously try to use this internally to our advantage, but we also use it externally to say, here's what's happening and here are some of the challenges. So we serve the most water-intensive industries. Our model at the bottom, which is shared, involves marrying technology and people so that we deliver value for customers, hence the ability to see what's going on. We've got global capabilities. This is a slide depicting where our R&D centers are. Not as important as where all of our people are, which is basically in every country that a U.S. company is allowed to operate in. And when you get down to the customers, it's basically a who's who list of the large industries. So in the food and beverage industries, here's one depiction. I could go on with other slides. And in broad industry, across light manufacturing, heavy manufacturing, metals, power, energy sectors, we're basically in all those sectors, and they are big, as I pointed out earlier, water consumers. So already many of these customers are reacting. So these are a list of a number of companies' water goals. A typical one, and these are fairly aggressive, it would be ours, is like a 20% reduction, typically per unit output, over a 5-year period. So 4 to 5% a year is a very typical goal for companies that are taking aggressive stances on this issue, which the companies listed here are. The most aggressive stance would be the Coca-Cola goal, which is, for a beverage company, pretty unique, which is they want to be water neutral. Now, that's a tough standard. If you're shipping water every day out of your plant, but that's their goal, and obviously they're going to have to do it outside of their business to accomplish that with partnering with other people. But I would say industry understands this and is working on driving this because they're frankly worried they're going to run out. So Coke, in their proxy every year, lists their biggest risks. Water's their number 2 risk globally, according to Coke. The group that gets together in Davos every year, which really doesn't get a lot done, but at least they publish a report. And for the last 5 years in this report, water has been either 1 or 2 in terms of global risk, cited by the group together at Davos. Now, maybe they're just dehydrated from altitude. Could be, or the late night parties, which I've heard so much about. So here's what else is going on. So if you get down a more granular level, so what do we do? So we have, we try to work our sustainability story into the core of what we do. So we're in some sexy businesses like washing towels and linens or providing the substrates to do it, the products. So in Hyatt, we would help them wash their towels and linens in all their hotels. We've developed technology which allows them to do it in 3-cycle washes instead of 6-cycle washes. Why is that important? It's 50% reduction in water and energy. So you can wash double the towels for the same amount of money, water, and energy. This is, substantial changes. We also drive the same thing in the kitchen where you use warewashing equipment, and in the cooling towers at the top where we now have technology which allows us not to use water just twice, but to use it 5 and 6 times. The challenge with using water over and over is basic. You have precipitation or evaporation, which means water over time becomes harder and harder, and it becomes tougher and tougher to use. So the ability to use this multiple times obviously takes pressure off fresh water. But it's a trick because you have a lower quality of water that you have to use for whatever process you're using. Pepsi was also a great example. Pepsi, we've done a lot of work, and Pepsi is pushing on water sustainability as well. So in all their plants, we turn where they previously had garden hoses with basically soap to drive lubricant so they can run high speed into products which are now a dry product which takes all these hoses off the line. So this reduces quite a bit of water. We try to clean Pepsi plants at lower temperatures with less water. So all this stuff isn't the most exciting stuff in the world, but at the end of the day, this is what fundamentally makes a change, because if you don't change the way you do stuff, you're not going to change water. And then the favorite example, most recent, is Dow, where they had a plant that was basically facing a shutdown from the community because they were in a water-scarce community and they were the huge water user of that community. So we went in, reprocessed, looked at how they did things, and ended up reducing their water usage in a year by 1 billion gallons. Now, it's hard to imagine how big 1 billion gallons is, so we put it here. This is one facility. So this is the type of work that goes on, and you can go on and on about how we try to dewater and do this for facilities. The challenge with all this, and a lot of the good efforts, is it's great progress, but if you have a 50% mismatch, and you're saving 20% on 20% of the consumption, you fundamentally aren't going to make a big enough dent to make this go away. And we probably aren't going to make it go away. Humans best react to a crisis, and unfortunately, we're going to reach crisis in some geographies in a pretty short order. So what are other things? There's market pricing, there's regulation. The challenge with market pricing on water is politically, this has been kind of a no-go zone. The real debate is water a right of people, or is this a privilege? If you consider it a right, then you got to price it at such that everybody can afford it. It's basically a philosophy almost every country has come to because it's so hugely important to health, hygiene of the people. But perversely, you can't see it on the chart. The lowest price of water is 3 cents per cubic meter. Where would that be? Well, of course, Jeddah. Because why would you price water in the desert high? It would be the lowest price, of course, because it's not there. I mean, it makes no sense at all. But that's the lowest price in the world. And the highest price in the world is in the other water-saturated region, which would be Europe, where there, instead of 3 cents in Copenhagen, I don't remember the number, $7.38, right? Pretty big disparity in water pricing around the world. In the emerging markets, China is around 22 cents. So what's happening in Shanghai region, where we just built a facility, they are now fixing and starting to drive price up to industry. So they're trying to use market pricing to change. And China's behind the curve because they got little water, as I mentioned, and the water they've got is horribly polluted. So they know they've got a major problem or could try to use market forces to change it. But it's not fast enough. And in India, they're using regulation where they basically tell you can X cubic meters and that's it. And if you need more, you got to shut the plant down. And so we've got many customers who are faced with this situation. The point is, this is not moving fast enough either. And if we sit around and wait for all the individual countries, and if you probably put here, I don't even know in this municipality, I think in the Twin Cities there's something like 30 water units that would have to collectively decide how they're going to manage water uniformly, self-assemble, as Larry likes to say, which probably isn't going to happen. And so I don't see that is going to be a big push. So the other thing that's happening is many companies are starting to create their own water price. And they're trying to understand what the value of water ought to be if you're going to be at kind of a static use equals replenishment. And this is probably the smartest thing that we can do in the near term. So Nestle was one of the early pioneers of this because Nestle is a giant food company around the world with big operations in emerging markets, has an acute need for water, and is acutely aware that water could put them out of business in key markets. So they're now trying to price water differently than the market price. Otherwise, you can't justify capital to drive down water consumption. The math just doesn't work. At 3 cents a cubic meter, you can't invest a nickel and get a return. So you need to start looking at this differently, which is also why we are now working with a company called TrueCost to develop a global water tool that all companies can use by watershed to try to get a clear picture of this part of Shanghai, what the uses in that watershed, the projected scarcity date is, and what the risks are, and come up with a number that they should probably plug in for capital use. Now, companies do this all the time for cost of capital. When we buy a company in Russia, we use a higher cost of capital to try to understand and mimic the risk inherent with building something in Russia versus building it in the US. So companies have done this in the past, just not with water. And what we're going to try to do is encourage people to do more of this. The other big goal is to measure progress. Now, we have a lot of people trying to help here, and there's been a lot of help. McKinsey's been huge in this. There's been other companies. UN is all over this, and they are working to measure water status by watershed, which is the only way you can look at water, and then we will use that to plug into our UN tools. So internally, we try to eat our own cooking. We're not always great at it. One of my favorite early stories, when I was walking around and visiting our facilities, you walk into competitive products in areas we serve, and you ask your people in the plant, well, why do you have a competitive program in here? Well, they were cheaper. That's a joke. That's not a good answer, by the way. So, they're cheaper, but the money doesn't come back to us, so this is kind of a problem. So, we are trying to make sure that we drive our programs in our facilities as well, and make sure as we build plants and we look at facilities that we are trying to understand where the pressures are. We have 104 plants around the world, and we have several of them which we would say are sort of moving into code red zone based on water supply and water replenishment. Doesn't hit in the next 5 years, but will likely hit in the next 10 years. And when you start looking at how long it takes to build these facilities, to get regulatory approval and everything else, you've got to be on this and on it fairly early and not be caught sleeping. So this is an issue that we're also pushing. So finally, right, smart philosophy. Frog doesn't drink up the water in the pond in which it lives. It's basically philosophy that we're trying to drive, and we're trying to drive the understanding that in many parts of the world, we are at risk of doing just that. So thank you. Thanks for your time.
So aren't we glad he didn't take the advice and not speak about water? We certainly learned a lot about water. So we're going to be having question and answers. Please raise your hands. A mic will come to you, and say who you are. I'll give the first question. You know, when I teach that businesses need to have a purpose for their business that not only benefits the bottom line, but benefits society. Clearly that's the case at Ecolab. How does that help Ecolab to have such an animating purpose?
Well, yeah, and then we boil it down to cleaner, safer, healthier. I think it helps on a bunch of levels. It galvanizes people, I think, increasingly from a talent brand or recruiting people. A lot of people want to be successful, but they want to be successful doing things that are helpful for world society as a whole. I'd say that's a big value we're finding for the generation coming out now. And I just believe if you're going to drive energy in an organization, that it can't simply be hitting an EPS target or some other financial target. That can be fun and it's important, but people also want a purpose, I think, larger than themselves and larger than just financial. So I don't think you're going to drive deep engagement if you don't have a purpose somewhat bigger than simply we want to make money.
That's great, and Ecolab is a wonderful example of that. Who's our first question out here? Do we have a question over here? And be prepared for the next one.
Hi there. Excuse me. My name is Jack Anderson. I'm a student with Gustavus Adolphus College. And you mentioned that you do some work with the UN, and I'm a political science major as well as business management. And I'm just curious, what is the cooperation level with other countries outside the United States with water reduction? Do you get the same cooperation with China as you do with the US or some of the other European countries, or what are your thoughts on that?
Yes, I would say China has clearly understood their water challenges and is aggressively trying to drive change. But China's got a couple of challenges. They have, I would say, very high environmental standards. They have very high food safety standards, if you read what's written. But historically, it's been driven really, if you will, market by market. It has not been federalized, and they are working now to federalize it because they aren't getting local adherence. Economics still trump ecology, and they're trying to drive that change. I would say China is looking for partners to help drive that change. That's their philosophy right now. In other regions, yes, but I would say, you've got also where it can go almost to the extreme. There was a recent article about Germany's bent. Germany is water rich. It's not really their #1 challenge, but Germans love to save, and so they are now moving so aggressively on water savings that it's costing them a lot of money because their water system's stagnant. So they honestly have to now put in equipment to keep it from going bad. So, you can take this stuff too far as well where it starts coming back on you. But, you've got situations, Jeddah, Middle East, where you're using a lot of energy to create fresh water because they're doing it by taking salt water and creating fresh water. In those markets, they're going to have to do something about the price of water ultimately, and they've just been very reluctant to do it.
Next question over here.
A great speech and a chance to learn an awful lot. One of the pieces that seemed to be missing from your comments, I wonder if you'd address it, is the role of utilities and the movement of water and how pricing might be affected in that world.
Yeah, well, utilities, at least in most countries, their pricing is controlled, and it's typically controlled by government in terms of what they can charge. So, I think pricing's got a place, and there are many schemes that you could dream up that might work and keep it low for X gallons per human and then higher for those who consume too much. I would say two things. I'd say broadly, almost everything that we've designed has been designed for a world of plentiful water and cheap water. That's how we've thought about it. So if you take this community, so we have a lot of water, but the way we manage it is we have this semi-renewable resource called the Mississippi River. We take 2% of the water out of the river before it hits the cities, and then we supplement it with a lot of groundwater, right, below surface water, which is principally what we use. We use a lot more of water from the ground than we do the Mississippi. So at the end, we pump 4% back in the Mississippi. So it ends up with more water afterwards, because basically what we're doing is sucking out the aquifer and using that water, because really you can just stick a straw down in your ground for free. And the challenge with that is the aquifer takes a long time to replenish. So our whole design is not right. Now, if you went to the Mississippi, if you went and said, okay, we're going to double the outtake of the Mississippi, which I think would probably be the smart strategy, You would then have a lot of people who are friends of the Mississippi, probably a group, and that will be a problem there. And ultimately, you've got to look at this more holistically than one body of water. There's no friends of an aquifer because you can't see it. And you know, this is White Bear Lake and all the rest. I mean, this is the challenge. And so the whole world is not designed for the world we're moving into. So there's going to be a lot of gear shifts. Take dairy. Dairy was in Wisconsin. Dairy, we didn't hear them, but the cows trampled over Minnesota on the way to California one night. And most of the dairy is in California now. But as we all know, California's in this monster drought, and dairy is a very water-intensive business. I mean, it takes a lot to feed the cow. I mean, look at milk. It's principally water. Where's it coming from? And so the challenge there is now you've got this huge industry, which is very water-intensive, in a place with not a lot of water. So there's going to be, I think, a migration back to industry planting itself where water is. So you got all the steel mills at southern Michigan, Lake Michigan, for a reason. They need a lot of water. There's a lot of water in Lake Michigan. You know, but that was built in the 20s and 30s. But we're going to have much more of that, I think, going forward, because you just can't ship this stuff.
Next question over here.
After looking at your slide and the proportion of saltwater to freshwater, do you think we can solve the global problem without solving the economics of converting saltwater to freshwater? I mean, can that 2.5% that exists solve?
Yeah, so desalination, yeah, you know, look, I think we'll get, you know, you're already seeing it, so I don't remember the price tag, but San Diego is building a monster desal unit now for its community, and obviously that's how the Middle East handles it. And so desalination, you know, I mean, there's two methods. It's boil the ocean, it's evaporation, or it's membrane, which is basically you're pushing water through filters that are so fine they capture the salt and all the other particulates. But think about the amount of energy it takes to push water through a membrane that fine. So it's a highly energy intensive enterprise if you're doing evaporation or membrane. You know, the physics of that may get more efficient, but I don't think they're fundamentally going to change completely as you go through. But, you know, water's important. I don't think humanity is going to, you know, leave the earth because of water. We will pay the price because we don't have any other choice. Challenge with it is you can't ship it long distances effectively. You know, each gallon of water weighs 8 pounds. So it's heavy. So you're not going to be, you know, carting this stuff across oceans. It's hard to move it inland, you know, very far. So there are just some natural barriers we're going to have to figure out and get through. But desal is going to be one of the big answers. It will increase supply. But we're also going to have to get after demand.
Okay, we have time for one more question. Senator Bob.
Well, that was my question, desalination and how important it'll be in solving the problems.
Well, I'll add one more question then. If you haven't already answered desalination, is when you think about it, we think Bakken energy and the new energy revolution in America has really given us more economic vibrancy. But as you paint the picture for water, it looks like America is well positioned for a future with a more scarce water supply. And also when you say it's best to ship stuff that already has the water in it, that would seem to be good for industry. So if we could close with a recap of desalination as well as how does this impact America's long-term competitiveness?
Yeah, well, you know, I'm now dry on all information pertaining to desalination. meaning I think that's basically the perspective. I think it's going to be part of the answer. It won't by itself solve it, but it's going to be very important for coasts, which is where most people live. So it's going to be a big part of the solution. In terms of, energy, you know, look, fracking gets a lot of criticism for water usage. You know, what fracking is doing is producing natural gas. Most natural gas is replacing coal, and coal takes more water per BTU than natural gas does, even through fracking. So that's always left out of the conversation. It's like this zero-sum game. But the truth is, you're using less water, you're creating, energy which has 50% less carbon than coal, and that's what it's displacing principally. So, I think that becomes a conversation that's not very rich or fully informed as we go forward. But yeah, I think United States, because of energy, I would say also agriculture. I think Europe is in a similar position on agriculture, but not energy, or if you go farther east in Europe. But that is I think, a bright spot for this country. So we are not in a water-starved on average, but we have some acute situations in the Southwest and other parts of this country. Southeastern part of the country is pretty water-starved too. So we're going to have to figure out how we balance industry and where it belongs. Minnesota will be good.
Great. Thanks again.